If you have £250,000 sitting in your pension pot, and you're planning to draw £20,000 a year from it, that feels reasonable. You run the numbers, it's 8% a year, the market average is about that, you should be fine. That's the calculation. And it's wrong, not slightly wrong. Historical data from 100 years of UK and global markets shows that if you'd retired at exactly the wrong moment and tried to live off 8% of your pot, you'd have run out of money before your 80th birthday in the vast majority of cases. Not because you spent too much, because of when the market fell. Most people look at an average return figure and think it's a promise. It isn't. It's a number that smooths out crashes that, in real life, happen at the worst possible time, right after you stop working, right when you can't replace what you've lost. And it gets more specific than that. A £250,000 pot has a nominal return sitting around 8.3% historically. Subtract a modest management fee of 0.5%, then strip out inflation, and your real, usable return is somewhere around 5.5%. That's your actual engine, and you're asking it to run at 8%. I can't tell you what interest rates will be doing this time next year. No one can. But the historical numbers are what they are. So the question isn't, do I have enough? It's a more precise one. How much do you actually need, depending on whether you want £20,000 a year, £30,000, or £40,000? And what role the state pension plays in bridging that gap? The answers are going to surprise you. And in some cases, they'll reassure you more than you expect. Let's start with Harry. Harry is 65, just handed in his notice, and he's done the sums. He's got a decent pension pot, the mortgage is paid off, and he's worked out he needs about £20,000 a year to live comfortably. Council tax, energy, the car, a couple of holidays. He feels sorted. What Harry hasn't accounted for is sequence of returns risk. And it's the thing that undoes more retirement plans than almost anything else. Here's what it means in plain terms. Imagine two people retire on the same day with identical pots. Over the next 20 years, they get identical average returns. But one of them happens to retire just before a significant market drop, 2000, 2008, 2022, and the other retires just after one. 20 years later, their outcomes are completely different. Not because of what they earned on average, but because of the order in which the returns arrived. When you're drawing money out of a pot and the market falls in the early years, you're selling units at low prices. You can't wait for the recovery the way you could when you were accumulating. That damage is permanent. So what does this mean for the actual numbers? If you want £20,000 a year in retirement, starting at 55 and planning to age 95, the honest figure, accounting for sequence risk, inflation, and a realistic fee structure, is closer to £650,000. Not £250,000, not £400,000, £650,000. If you want genuine resilience across every historical scenario, that number lands hard, I know. But it's worth understanding why it's that high, because once you do, you can see exactly where it can be reduced. Now add the tax layer. If your savings are sitting in a general investment account rather than wrapped inside an ISA or pension, HMRC takes a cut of your dividends and your capital gains along the way. At a £40,000 income level, the difference between a tax-efficient structure and an unprotected one can amount to several £1,000s a year, quietly eroding the pot you've spent decades building. Feeling anxious when you see a figure like £650,000 just to generate a basic income isn't a sign that you've done something wrong. The UK tax system and the way inflation compounds over a 30 or 40-year retirement are genuinely complicated, far more so than anything most of us were ever shown how to plan for. The system is intricate. The anxiety is a reasonable response to that complexity. But here's the thing. That headline number of £650,000 assumes you're doing nothing to optimize. In practice, 3 specific levers can cut what you need to accumulate quite significantly. The state pension is one of them, and most people underestimate how much difference it makes when it's properly factored in. We'll get to those levers shortly. But first, there's a trap that catches a lot of people before they even get to the numbers. And it's built into something most of us have been told our whole lives to aim for. There's a couple I think about sometimes. Surrey, late 60s. Between them, they've got a house worth around £800,000. Paid off, no debts, everything tidy. On paper, they look wealthy. In practice, they're living almost entirely on the state pension and watching every purchase. They won't touch the house. It was the family home. The children grew up there, and somewhere along the way, owning it outright became the whole definition of financial security. I understand that feeling completely. For years, I believed the same thing, that clearing the mortgage was the finish line, the moment everything clicked into place. It took a long time to see what was actually happening on the other side of that line. A house worth £800,000 generates no income. It pays no bills. It doesn't cover the council tax, the energy standing charge, the car insurance renewal that goes up every year regardless. The equity is real, but it's locked, and locked equity has a cost that doesn't show up in any statement. There's a term for this: dead equity. Capital sitting in an asset that produces nothing, while you ration your spending in retirement because your liquid savings aren't sufficient to cover a decent standard of living. And then there's the inheritance tax dimension, which most people don't confront until it's quite late. The current IHT threshold sits at £325,000. With the residence nil rate band, a couple passing a home to direct descendants can shelter up to £1 million. But that full allowance depends on circumstances, and the thresholds have been frozen. For many families in the southeast, a significant portion of what they intend to leave their children is actually earmarked for HMRC, whether they realize it or not. Here's a straightforward illustration. A property worth £600,000 sitting idle produces nothing. But if downsizing or a structured equity release frees up £200,000 and that money is placed into an ISA, it can generate around £8,000 a year completely free of income tax and capital gains tax for the rest of your life. The house still exists in some form. The children may still inherit something, but you are no longer rationing yourself to preserve an asset that the tax system may partially reclaim anyway. The trade-off is real. Staying put offers psychological security, familiarity, continuity, not having to make a difficult decision. That matters, and it shouldn't be dismissed. But the cost of that security is a retirement lived with less income than you've earned, and an estate that may be considerably smaller than you imagine once the IHT calculation runs. Neither choice is obviously right. What's worth examining honestly is whether the decision to keep the house untouched is genuinely a financial choice, or whether it's an emotional one dressed up as financial wisdom. Most of the time, when I've seen people work through this properly, it's the latter, and once they name it, they can make a clearer decision about what they actually want. The mortgage-free trap is about identity as much as money. The next trap is different. It's about an assumption almost everyone makes about how their own health will unfold, and it's the one that leaves retirement plans most dangerously underfunded. Most retirement plans are built on a quiet assumption that once you stop working, your spending gradually declines. You slow down, you travel less, the big costs taper off. It's a tidy model. It's also not what the data shows. What actually happens for a significant portion of people looks more like a U-shape. The early years of retirement, the so-called go-go years, tend to be active and frankly expensive. Travel, home improvements, helping adult children, pursuing things you didn't have time for during your working life. Spending in this phase often runs higher than expected. Then there's a middle period, the slow-go years, where things genuinely do settle. You're less mobile, less inclined toward big expenditures, more comfortable at home. This is the phase most retirement models are built around. And it does exist. But then comes the third phase, and this is the one that gets left out of almost every planning conversation I've seen. Age UK puts average residential care costs at somewhere between £15,000 and over £50,000 per year, depending on location and level of need, That's not an edge case figure. That's the lived reality for a substantial number of people in their 80s and beyond, and it arrives at exactly the point when most retirement plans have budgeted for spending to be at its lowest. The ONS survival data makes this more concrete. A couple both age 65 today has roughly a 38% chance that at least one of them will reach 95. Not 85. 95. That's a 30-year retirement for one partner, potentially the last several years of which involve care costs that dwarf anything in the original plan. Planning for your spending to drop 25% after age 75 isn't conservative. It's a gamble on a version of aging that a significant minority of people simply won't experience. We tend to plan for the holidays and quietly skip past the hospital stays. That's human. Nobody wants to sit down with a spreadsheet and model their own physical decline. But the financial consequence of not doing it is that the money runs out precisely when you are least able to earn more, least able to make changes, and most dependent on having it. The U-shape isn't a worst-case scenario to plan around. For many people, it's just the shape of the thing. This matters practically because it changes how you think about the middle years of retirement. If you know the care curve is real, you don't draw down aggressively in your 70s. You keep more in reserve. You think differently about what the ISA is actually for. You reassess what leaving the house untouched really costs you, because that equity may be exactly what funds the final phase. We usually plan for the years we look forward to. The honest plan includes the years we don't. Let's go back to Harry. He's retiring at 65. He's done the right things. Pension contributions for decades, some ISA savings on the side, no significant debts. His plan is to draw about £20,000 a year from his private pension until the state pension kicks in and covers part of that need. What Harry hasn't fully absorbed is that the state pension age is now 67. So for 2 full years, every penny of his living costs comes from his private pot. No bridge, no top-up, just drawdown. That's not unusual. A lot of people retire before 67, either by choice or because their health or employer makes the decision for them. The gap is built into the system and largely invisible until you're standing in it. Now add one more variable. In those same 2 years, the market drops 15%. It happened in 2022. The mini-budget, the bond market reaction, pension funds caught badly positioned. It wasn't a slow decline. It was sharp, sudden, and it arrived without warning in the middle of ordinary life. People who happened to retire that year and were drawing heavily from their pots took damage they couldn't undo. This is sequence of returns risk made specific. When you're pulling money out of a falling market, you're locking in losses. The units you sell at a low price are gone. When the market recovers, and it does recover, you have fewer units left to benefit from that recovery. The pot that survives a bad sequence is permanently smaller than one that didn't face it, even if the long-run average return ends up identical. For Harry, 2 years of full drawdown into a 15% market fall doesn't just hurt in the short term. It reshapes the entire trajectory of his retirement. The numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. If Harry starts with £400,000 and draws £20,000 a year, while the market falls 15% in year 1 and stays flat in year 2, he could end that bridge period with somewhere around £300,000 before any recovery has had a chance to help him. That's a permanent reduction in his base. Every subsequent year of income, every future calculation, runs off a smaller number. This is the stress test most retirement calculators don't run. They show you the average. They don't show you what happens when the bad years arrive first. So how does Harry protect himself? And how do you? The problem isn't unsolvable. It just requires being deliberate about 3 things that most people either don't know about or leave until too late. The first is the cash buffer. Before you retire, or as early as possible once you have, set aside 2 years of living expenses in cash. Not invested, not in your pension, just accessible, sitting there. Current account, easy access savings, premium bonds if you prefer. The exact vehicle matters less than the principle. What this does is give your invested portfolio time to breathe. If the market drops in year 1 of your retirement, You draw from the cash buffer instead of selling units at a loss. You give the portfolio a chance to recover before you touch it. It sounds simple because it is, and yet most people arrive at retirement with everything invested and no cash cushion at all. 2 years is the number that tends to work. Long enough to ride out most market downturns without being forced to sell at the wrong moment. Short enough that the cash isn't sitting idle for decades earning nothing. The second lever is withdrawal sequencing. The order in which you draw from different accounts has a meaningful effect on how long your money lasts and how much tax you pay along the way. The general principle that tends to serve people well is this: draw from your general investment account first, then your pension, taking advantage of the 25% tax-free lump sum entitlement, and keep your ISA until last. The ISA is the most tax-efficient asset you own in retirement. It grows free of income tax and capital gains tax indefinitely, with no requirement to draw from it at any particular age. Every year it stays invested and untouched is a year of compounding that costs you nothing in tax. Drawing it down early to preserve the pension often works against you. The third lever is guardrails. This is a spending discipline rather than an investment one. In years when your portfolio grows well, you allow yourself a modest increase in withdrawals, in line with inflation or slightly above. In years when the market falls significantly, you reduce your withdrawals by around 10%. Not dramatically. Not in a way that upends your life. Just enough to let the portfolio stabilize rather than accelerating its decline at the worst possible moment. I check in on energy bills and council tax with people every year. Not because they're exciting, but because they're the costs that quietly outpace inflation and erode the buffer without anyone noticing until it's already happened. Those two alone can add several £100 a year to your baseline if you're not watching them. These three levers, cash buffer, withdrawal sequencing, guardrails, won't eliminate every risk. No plan does. But they address the specific vulnerabilities that actually destroy retirement portfolios: early sequence damage, unnecessary tax drag, and uncontrolled spending creep. Used together, they can meaningfully reduce the headline capital figure you need to retire on. That gap between £650,000 and what you actually have starts to close when the structure is right. There's a pattern I've watched play out more times than I can count. Someone reaches retirement with a genuinely decent pot, enough to live well, travel occasionally, help the grandchildren, enjoy the years they've earned, and then they don't. Not because the money isn't there, because spending it feels wrong. Every time the balance dips, even slightly, even as planned, there's a quiet alarm that goes off, a feeling that something has been lost, that the number going down means something is going wrong, even when it isn't. So they spend less. They skip the holiday. They tell themselves they'll relax about it next year. This isn't a character flaw. After 40 years of being the person who saves, who provides, who keeps the household financially stable, switching into a mode where you deliberately draw down what you've built goes against something quite deep. The instinct to protect the principal isn't irrational. For most of your working life, it was exactly the right instinct. It just isn't the right instinct anymore. Retirement savings aren't a monument to your working life. They're not a number to be preserved and admired. They're fuel for the years when you have the health, the time, and ideally the people around you to actually use it. A pot that reaches zero on the last day of a well-lived retirement has done its job perfectly. A pot that's still largely intact because you were too anxious to draw from it has, in a real sense, failed you. The psychological shift required here is genuine, and it takes time. Knowing intellectually that it's fine to spend doesn't automatically quiet the alarm. What tends to help is having a structure, a plan with clear numbers, clear sequencing, clear guardrails, so that when you do draw from the pot, it feels like following a plan rather than raiding something you shouldn't touch. That's what turns the anxiety from a fog into something manageable. Not permission to spend recklessly. A framework that tells you, specifically, what drawing down looks like when it's going right. The money is there to be used. That was always the point. So let's bring the numbers together. If you're retiring at 65 and the state pension covers roughly £11,500 a year, which is approximately what a full new state pension currently pays, then the gap you need your private savings to fill is smaller than the headline figures suggest. For £20,000 a year in retirement, you need your pot to generate around £8,500 on top of the state pension. With a sensible withdrawal rate that points to somewhere in the region of £320,000 in private savings. Manageable for many people who've been contributing consistently. For £30,000 a year, the gap is around £18,500. You're looking at roughly £550,000 to £600,000 in private savings, depending on your age at retirement and how you structure the drawdown. For £40,000 a year, the state pension covers less than a third of what you need. Private savings in the region of £800,000 to £850,000 give you genuine resilience, enough to weather a bad sequence of returns in the early years without the portfolio being permanently compromised. These aren't worst-case figures, they're honest ones, and they assume you're using the three levers, the cash buffer, the right withdrawal sequence, the guardrails, rather than drawing blindly from a single pot with no structure around it. If you want to stress test your own numbers against a U-shaped spending curve, one that accounts for the care costs that most plans quietly ignore, the spreadsheet is in the description. It runs 3 scenarios side by side, so you can see exactly where your plan holds and where it doesn't. Retirement done well isn't about having the biggest possible number. It's about understanding the shape of what you actually need, building a structure that protects it, and then genuinely letting yourself live on it. That's the whole point of the thing.